They bulldozed a trench through my ranch without a by-your-leave. One morning, heavy machines arrived and ripped the place apart, toppling the oak I'd planted for my dead wife right where my granddaughter could see it. She cried while the machines kept eating the earth. The HOA president, Carla, stood there smirking behind the county sheriff she'd brought with her, telling me it was for the good of the neighborhood. So I cooked up a plan to cut their water off for good. What she didn't know was her whole little project rested on a lie, a secret that was about to make me the most powerful person in this valley. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, because you won't believe what comes next. And if you think homeowners should beat a corrupt HOA, hit subscribe. You're going to love how this ends. The first sign something was wrong wasn't a letter or a phone call. It was a flash of high-vis orange through the cottonwoods down by the creek. I was fixing a loose porch board, my knees complaining, while my granddaughter Elise sketched beside me in her notepad. You learn the rhythms of your land. When deer cross at dusk, how the hawk calls on windless afternoons. Bright orange vests and metal tripods don't belong in those rhythms. I put down the hammer and told Elise to stay where she was. Even if I move slow these days, I moved down the pasture toward the creek faster than I felt. There were 3 of them pounding stakes a few dozen yards from the water line. The youngest glanced up and muttered something to the clipboard man. By the time I reached them, they'd gone defensive. I kept my voice level. Morning. Can I help you, boys? The man with the clipboard looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Just doing our job, sir, he said, eyes on the ground. I pointed at the fence they'd crossed 100 yards back. Your job's on my land. I didn't hire you. He finally looked at me and sighed like I'd ruined his week. We're authorized. HOA easement extension, I almost laughed. I'm not in your HOA, I said. Never have been. This ranch was here long before your gated subdivision was even a drawing. He shrugged and jabbed the pen toward the manicured lawns over the ridge. Tell it to them. We've got a work order. They turned back to their machines. Just hired hands, I thought. But standing there on the soil that had held my family, being treated like I didn't exist, a cold knot tightened in my chest. This place wasn't just acres and fences. Claire and I had dreamed of land like this, a spot where the world couldn't get its hooks in. After she was gone, it was the only thing that made sense to me. When my daughter and son-in-law died in that wreck 2 years later, this ranch became everything to Elise and me. It was our refuge. I'd planted an oak for Claire on the ridge where you could look down at the creek. Elise and I sat there sometimes, and I'd tell stories about her grandma. The land held those memories. It was all we had left of them. So when Carla Withers turned up at my gate 3 days after the surveyors, flanked by 2 sheriffs, I knew this wasn't a clerical error. She was in her 50s, rigid as the papers she held like a talisman. Mr. Travis, she announced. It wasn't a question. One deputy younger looked uncomfortable. The other kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. Carla did the talking, waving a packet of documents like evidence. The board has approved a water pipeline, she said. The easement is legally valid. Construction begins next week. I told her what I told the survey crew. This is private property. You have no easement here. She gave me a thin, superior smile, the kind people give when they think they've already won. We discovered a gap in the original county filings from 1974, Carla said with a tone like she was explaining basic math to a child. Our legal team has confirmed it holds up. The pipeline will be installed. Your personal objections don't override community development. I spent the next several days draining my savings, dialing every land use attorney within 4 counties. Most didn't respond. The one who did agreed to meet me for coffee. He skimmed the documents Carla had slapped into my hands and exhaled, slow, heavy, defeated. I hate to tell you this, he said, sliding the paperwork back toward me, but she's right. They found a dormant clause from decades ago designed for public water expansion. No one uses language like this anymore, which is exactly why it slipped through. You could challenge it, but you'd be pouring money into a fight you'd likely lose. He looked at me, genuinely sorry. And they're banking on that. Hope is a strange thing. You don't realize how tightly you've clung to it until someone quietly takes it away. I walked out of that cafe like my insides were scooped clean. They had the attorneys, the political sway, the loophole, the muscle. I had a deed to land that was about to be carved open. The bulldozers arrived just after sunrise the next Monday. The sound of engines rolling over my fields was what woke me. A deep, unnatural growl. I stood on the porch with a cold cup of coffee and watched them cut across my pasture. Dew-soaked grass folded and tore beneath the weight of steel treads. Elise came out beside me and slipped her hand into mine. She didn't cry. That silence carved deeper than any wail could. The lead machine lowered its blade and crept toward the ridge, toward Claire's oak. For one breath, I considered sprinting. Out there, throwing myself in front of it, shouting, fighting, clawing. But I knew how that would end. A pair of cuffs, Elise alone on the porch, the machines continuing on without me. So I stayed rooted where I was as the blade met the trunk. There was a brief resistance, as if the tree itself refused to surrender. Then a crack that felt like it split through my chest. The oak toppled, the place where I talked to Claire, gone as though it had never been. Elise gave a small, broken sound and buried her face against my side. I wrapped an arm around her, my eyes fixed on the machine grinding the stump into splinters. They weren't just carving up land. They were erasing my memory of the people I'd loved. I brought Elise inside and shut the door. The grief didn't fade, but something settled in with it. Something colder. Something controlled. Something that waits. I stepped back out to the front gate and watched them tear trenches through the ranch. If they were going to take, then I would take too. My first move wasn't revenge, not yet. It was reason. A chance to speak, to make them understand. Tycho. HOA board held their monthly meeting in a pristine, over-sanitized clubhouse that smelled like pool water and lemon spray. Anyone living within county lines could attend if they signed in as guests. So I shaved, put on a clean shirt, slid my property records into a folder, and walked into the room. A handful of homeowners sat scattered among folding chairs. At the front sat Carla and 4 other board members behind a plastic table. She looked right at home there, pen-tapping, posture sharp, ego practically filling the room. When my name was called, I stepped to the podium. I kept steady, calm. I explained that my land had never fallen under their jurisdiction. I described the spring-fed stream, the livestock rotation, the water table that supported everything I tended. I tried to get them to see the land as more than dirt to lay pipe through. Carla let me talk for maybe 2 minutes before lifting her hand mid-sentence. "Thank you, Mr. Travis," she said, each word dipped in syrupy condescension. She nodded to a man beside her, a lawyer in an ill-fitting suit. He walked up and handed me a document, a cease and desist order. It prohibited me from interfering with their construction, on my own land. The lawyer smiled like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror. "You'll continue to receive access to the main water line. Consider it a gesture of goodwill, a courtesy, on the property I owned." The room stayed silent. The board stared at paperwork, like avoiding eye contact made them innocent. The lawyer droned on about property value increases and community progress, but none of it reached me anymore. I just stood there holding that paper like it was burning my hand, hope crushed clean. I walked out into the dusk, my hands trembling. A man who had been sitting in the back followed me to the lot. Older fellow, worn-down expression. "Don't take it personal," he murmured, glancing back toward the clubhouse. "She pulls this on everyone." His name was Mike. He'd lived here 2 decades. The HOA fined him $600 because his trash bin was visible for one afternoon. Another family got a lien for planting the wrong kind of shrub. Everyone hated it, but everyone was afraid. "That pipeline?" Mike said quietly. "Her brother's construction company got the contract. Kickbacks, nepotism, personal profit disguised as community improvement." As he spoke, on the survey diagram they'd shown me, the pipeline path didn't make any practical sense. It cut through the hardest, rockiest strip of my pasture, ground that'd fight any machine foolish enough to challenge it. If efficiency was the goal, they would have routed the line along the flatter stretch closer to the access road. But that wasn't what they'd done. No one in that boardroom listened to me, but my old engineering instincts had started turning gears. Something was wrong. Something wasn't lining up. I thanked Mike and headed home. For days, I watched the trench claw deeper across my land, a filthy, water-filled gouge growing longer after the rain, a raw wound separating me from the places I held sacred. Every time my eyes drifted to it, the fury simmered hotter. One afternoon, I couldn't stay on the porch any longer. I walked out over the trampled fence line, boots sinking into the loose, wet piles of overturned dirt. I didn't know where I was going, and I just followed the scar they'd carved. The pipeline track ran straight for a while, then suddenly hooked hard to the left, almost a perfect right-angle turn, aiming straight toward the oldest part of the spring system. That corner was my answer. The map I'd been given had been a lie. It didn't just accidentally depict a bad route. It was intentionally falsified. According to their paperwork, the water was supposed to come from the main creek, which they could barely argue fell under public use wording, but that wasn't where the current in the trench was flowing from. I could hear it. A soft, steady trickle. I followed the sound, pushing through tangled brush and tall grass until the truth revealed itself. Not the creek, not my land. A small, clear, unspoiled spring, the original source of all the water downstream, and it sat entirely on the property next to mine, a forgotten parcel that had belonged to an older gentleman who died years back, overgrown, unwatched, and now quietly being siphoned off by a pipeline that had no legal tie to it whatsoever. They hadn't tapped a public resource. They were stealing from a private spring. Their entire construction, victory, their legal threats, their arrogance was balanced on a complete misunderstanding of where the water came from. I stood there looking at that untouched spring, sunlight flickering across it, and a realization settled over me like a stone dropping into still water. The land was still on the books, and it was for sale. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first person I called was George Lindell. Old friend. We'd taken engineering courses together years back before he spent his career tracking water, the way it moved, shifted, carved, and sustained. Not a man of many words, but if you needed to understand water, he was the one to call. He didn't react much when I told him. Just gave a low grunt, interest, not surprise. He came out the next morning, and we walked past my property line, not toward the HOA's scar of a trench, but upstream to the overgrown land next door. The abandoned cottage was swallowed by brambles and vines. We followed the sound of water. When we reached the spring, it felt like stepping into a pocket of untouched world, clear water bubbling up from polished stone, shaded by ferns and tall grass. The heart of everything that lived downstream. George knelt, dipped his fingers into the pool, studied the flow, the slope, the lay of the earth. After a moment, he stood and dusted off his hands. "Well," he said evenly, "congratulations. You found the crime scene." He explained it simply, painfully simple. The HOA maps weren't wrong. They were incomplete on purpose. They claimed the water was coming from my section of the creek. Technically, that could fall under the archaic public utility loophole. But the creek was just the result. This spring was the source. "They're drinking from your house," George said, pointing, "but their straw is stuck in your neighbor's kitchen." And they figured no one would notice. Carla assumed I'd never check upstream. She figured I was just some old man standing in the way of progress. She miscalculated. Back at my kitchen table, a plan began knitting together. Risky, nearly impossible, but real. I pulled up the county tax records. The spring property was listed under one Arthur Miller, deceased. Property taxes unpaid for 3 years. The land was headed to foreclosure auction in 2 weeks. Starting bid was just the delinquent tax amount. For 10 acres and a cabin, that was nothing. For the source of the entire valley, there was still one final move left to play. I dialed Mike, the neighbor I'd spoken to back at the HOA meeting. I didn't lay everything out for him, just enough for him to understand what I needed. I asked him to start quietly picking up shares in the local water service cooperative, the tiny utility that controlled the region's water allocations. He didn't even pause to question it. He just said, "I'll handle it." When the day of the land auction arrived, I found myself sitting alone at my kitchen table, staring at the countdown clock on the bidding website. Each second felt like it was ticking down toward something irreversible. My palms were slick. I had gathered every cent I had, scraped from savings, emergency funds, and even sold a few things I never thought I'd part with. This was everything. One shot. If someone else outbid me, that was it. No plan B. In the final minute, the numbers jumped. Someone else wanted this land too. My pulse hammered like I'd sprinted a mile. I waited, counting down in my head. When the timer hit 10 seconds, I inhaled slowly, entered my maximum bid, and hit submit. The confirmation blinked onto the screen. Then the clock hit 0, sold. I sat frozen for a long moment, just absorbing it. Then a slow, steady smile formed. This wasn't triumph, not yet. This was simply the turning of the tide. I looked out toward the scarred trench winding across my property. Their pipeline gleamed like an insult in the setting light. Let's see how they react when the water they think they own is flowing from land that now legally belongs to me. The closing process took a week. A long, dull week where I watched Carla's brother's crew finalize the last connections of their grand pipeline project. They strutted around like kings of the valley, broad daylight, no secrecy. Why hide when you believe you're untouchable? They didn't realize they were trespassing now, and on land with water rights attached. The morning the deed was officially confirmed with my name stamped on it, I didn't celebrate. I went to work. George arrived at dawn, old maps in hand and mud on his boots. We laid out the plan on my porch table. No destruction. No sabotage. No crimes. Just nature, restored. The spring on the newly purchased parcel had originally split into 2 channels, one meandering toward the creek on my ranch, the other, smaller, feeding a shallow basin that watered the Miller pasture. Over time, leaves and soil had clogged the second flow. All we needed to do was clear the ancient channel 2 hours. That's all it took. Just shovels, rakes, sweat, and patience. We opened the path, shaped the bank with stones we found nearby, and let gravity handle the rest. Water is simple. It goes wherever it can move easiest. And the easiest route was no longer toward the HOA's shiny new intake pipe. The clear spring water bent and turned, sliding away from the trench and soaking into my newly revived pasture. Their big project, empty. Drained of its lifeblood. We walked back to my porch, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat watching the quiet land. About 3 hours later, things started to happen. A contractor truck barreled down the road, swerving into the HOA clubhouse. 15 minutes later, it sped straight to the fence line, dust cloud trailing behind. One worker stared into the dry trench like he'd just seen a ghost and immediately started yelling into his phone. Then the dominoes began to fall. Sprinklers died mid-rotation. Faucets sputtered. Toilets refused to refill. Lawns that had been obsessively watered began to wither right in front of their owners. Eyes, their brand new showcase system, the pride of the community, had gone bone dry. I watched the scene play out across the day. Carla's brother showed up, pacing, yelling, shaking his head. Then Carla herself arrived in her luxury car, storming around, pointing, demanding answers with her ever-present clipboard like it was some kind of divine scepter. They blamed equipment. They blamed contractors. They blamed nature. They blamed anything except the truth sitting 100 yards upstream. I rocked in my chair, coffee in hand, not saying a word. As evening settled into warm gold across the sky, I heard tires skidding up my driveway. Carla flung her door open and marched toward me, fury twisting her features. "What did you do?" she screamed, not even trying to hide the rage. "You have interfered with a certified utility system. I've already called the sheriff." I didn't move. I just motioned toward the empty chair beside me. "She didn't take it." "Carla," I said softly, "I haven't altered anything you built." Her glare could have cut steel. "Don't lie to me. Our water is gone. You did something." I reached inside and pulled out a manila envelope. From it, I handed her a notarized copy of the deed for the Miller property. She read it. Her face drained of all color. Then I handed her another document, The original water rights deed from 1957. Her world cracked open right there on my porch. That can't be, she stammered. You can't just... The board was in full-scale meltdown. Every phone line in the community was ringing. Every group chat was on fire. I had them right where I wanted them. The following morning, I drafted a plain, business-like letter. No threats, no emotion. Just two options. Spend years and a fortune trying to secure a new water source. Lease my water rights at a rate 10 times higher than what they had originally budgeted. There would be no negotiation. 2 days later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox, thick, formal, and stamped urgent. The HOA was calling an emergency board meeting. They requested my attendance. To anyone else, it might have sounded polite. But we all understood what it really was. A confrontation. This time, the clubhouse was packed to the walls. The place felt like it was about to combust from the heat of frustration. These were homeowners who had gone weeks with brown lawns, half-filled pet bowls, and taps that coughed air. They weren't irritated anymore. They were done. George and I stood near the back as we watched. At the front, the board sat behind a folding table like convicts awaiting sentencing. Carla was there, but she had lost control. Her shoulders were slumped, and her face was drawn. The president, Henderson, looked like he was one comment away from breaking into tears. Carla tried to take the mic. As we've said, she announced, her voice brittle, there has been an unexpected shift in the underground aquifer. Our contractor is assessing the situation. A man in the front row shot up from his chair. A geological shift? Really? My cousin works for the State Water Board. He said your system was pulling from land you didn't even have the rights to. The crowd roared. Henderson banged his gavel, but it was like trying to stop a hurricane with a fly swatter. That was my cue. I nodded to George, and we began walking down the aisle. The crowd parted without anyone asking. Every head turned toward us. I reached the table, opened my folder, and that's without saying a single word, placed a certified copy of the deed in my name, the 1957 water rights, documentation, the county survey maps showing the true spring boundary and the official auction purchase records. One by one. Slowly. Deliberately. Silence fell like a curtain. Henderson stared down at the documents as though they were written in fire. Carla's face was the color of old ash. I leaned toward the microphone. My name is Jack Travis, I said evenly, and nothing has changed underground. The only issue here is that this community built a pipeline to water it never had any legal claim to. I stepped back. George moved forward and broke down the hydrology of the valley. Clear, simple, undeniable. He traced the water flow on a large map for everyone to see. He showed the spring, the creek, and the natural direction of the runoff. Then he delivered it clean and sharp. You built your pipeline onto land that was never yours. You never owned this water, and you still don't. The room erupted. But this time, not at us. Heads turned toward Carla. Whispering turned into muttering, then into outright shouting. Carla snapped. She leapt from her chair, nearly knocking over the entire table. He's blackmailing us, she screamed. This is sabotage. He's extorting this community. I raised one hand, and somehow the room quieted again. No, I said. What I'm doing is respecting property law, something this board has been very selective about. Then I pulled out one last folder. And while we're talking about doing things legally, I continued, let's go over these. I slid the pipeline construction contracts across the table, the ones Mike helped me get through public records. They showed the project was awarded without competitive bidding. The contractor was Withers Construction, Carla's brother's company. The budget was inflated by nearly 40%, and the additional bids were fake. Shell companies created to simulate competition. The crowd didn't just react, it detonated. People surged to their feet, shouting over one another. Henderson looked like he might be physically sick. Carla stood frozen, completely exposed, completely powerless. A retired teacher I recognized from the neighborhood stood up and raised her voice. I moved to remove Carla Withers from this board immediately, for cause. Voices across the room echoed, seconded, second, second. Henderson, grateful for something procedural to cling to, called the vote. A sea of hands went up. Unanimous. The motion passes, he said, barely audible. Carla Withers is removed from this board. Carla didn't say a word. She just grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The room held its breath. Then Henderson turned to me. "Mr. Travis," he said quietly, "would you consider filling her position on the board?" I didn't answer right away. Revenge was one thing. Becoming part of the machine that tried to crush me was something else entirely. Over the next few days, I focused on negotiating the temporary water lease. The board was humbled, the valley was quiet, and the balance, finally, had shifted. The agreement we finally settled on was steady and reasonable. Not a punishment, not a charity, just the kind of arrangement that ensured the community could function while giving them time to establish a permanent and lawful source of water elsewhere. It felt like things were winding down, like maybe peace had returned to the valley. But people like Carla don't just step aside. They don't reflect. They don't accept consequences. When the thing they treasure most, their control, is taken away, they react with reckless, feral panic, and panicked people make dangerous choices. A few nights after the meeting, I was shaken awake by a sound, a deep, grinding engine noise echoing across the dark valley. I checked the clock. A little past 2 in the morning. That sound didn't belong out there, not at that hour, not in that place. I pulled on my jeans and boots, grabbed the big flashlight, and told Elise to lock the doors and stay put. I didn't take a gun. I didn't need one. I had prepared for something like this the day I bought the Miller land. I had put up a gate at the access road and mounted a motion-triggered trail camera. I had installed them for security. Now they were about to bear witness. As I reached the ridge, the engine roared louder, coughing like it was fighting itself. I moved carefully through the trees and saw lights cutting wild arcs over the spring. Someone had forced the gate. My jaw tightened, not with fear, but with something heavier. Inevitability. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's dispatch in a low, calm voice. "There's someone trespassing on my property." With a backhoe. "They're tampering with the water supply." Then I moved to where I could see clearly. There, in the seat of the backhoe, was Carla. She was trying to pile rocks and dirt to block the secondary channel we had opened. Her plan was almost pitiful. To reverse the water flow and force it back into the dead pipeline. But she had no understanding of soil or water. Every scoop of the bucket caused more damage. Her frantic digging tore up roots, banks, and the delicate slope around the spring. Then came the collapse. Her final shove sent the bucket into a patch of soft clay, and the whole bank gave way. Water surged downward in a sloppy rush, carving its own path, ripping through pasture and breaking through a neighboring farmer's fence. A storage shed flooded out completely. I recorded everything. By the time the patrol car appeared, its lights bouncing off the trees, Carla's machine was half buried in the mud she had made. The deputy who stepped out was the same young officer who once stood beside her when she tried to throw her weight around on my porch. Officer Lintz. He looked like a man who had outgrown being impressed by people like her. "Dispatch mentioned interference with a water source," he said. I pointed. "She's up there." We walked toward the scene. Carla scrambled down from the machine, filthy and soaked, and launched straight into a performance. "Thank goodness," she cried, waving her arms wildly. "You don't understand. He forced my hand. He sabotaged everything. I'm just trying to fix what he broke." Lintz stared at her for a long moment. Then I held up my phone and pressed play. The footage was perfect. Her car arriving. Her cutting the lock. Her climbing into the backhoe. The reckless destruction. Time-stamped. Clear. Unmistakable. The deputy didn't sigh. It was more like deflation. "Ma'am," he said, voice flat. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Her whole expression collapsed. "You can't arrest me. I run this community." "Not anymore," I said. Right then, the news van I had called earlier came up the road, headlights flashing. A reporter and her cameraman hurried toward us. The camera light snapped on. Carla, splattered with mud and wearing handcuffs, turned into its glare like a cornered animal. "He's destroying everything." She screamed. I stepped just far enough forward that the microphone picked me up. No, I said quietly. Just the part you took. 6 months passed. The scar where the trench once tore through my pasture has been filled and seeded. Grass grows over it now. A faint reminder, not a wound. I planted a young oak on the rise near where the old one once stood. Small but rooted, strong, a promise. Peace has returned to the valley. The silence is different now. Not tense, not wary, just clean, honest. You can hear the creek again, the wind in the leaves, the soft clucking of the hens in the morning. I did accept Henderson's offer, eventually. But I made my conditions clear. George would serve as technical advisor, and the board structure would change. There would be elections. No more rubber stamp loyalists. No more backroom deals. Mike was elected too. The woman who led the vote to remove Carla joined as well. Our first act was passing a bylaw, requiring a 2/3 vote from every homeowner for any major project power